One of the great ironies of clocks is that while their hands prudently tick away the seconds, hours, and years, they are not able to tell us the stories they accumulate along the way. That irony is a great shame, for a well-made clock will live to witness many human lifetimes. If the grandmother clock in the lobby of the Bolling Wilson Hotel could tell us a story, such a tale would begin in a little town carved out of the rugged wilderness. It would involve a prolific First Lady, whose devotion to love and duty would impact the course of American history, and an historic hotel that would re-energize the hub of Southwest Virginia, not once, but twice, in its long life. Such a tale begins in a distant age, many lifetimes ago. In the 1700s, the Wilderness Road snaked its way through these rippling mountains. Settlers migrating through the New River Valley from the northeast and the coastal lowlands pushed the boundary of the known world ever further west, when Virginia was still a colony on the edge of the vast British Empire. In time, taverns and lodging houses sprang up along the road, affording respite to weary travelers as they ventured deeper into the country's interior. These early buildings were typically simple structures built of logs, like the aptly named Log House Restaurant. As one of the oldest remaining structures in Wytheville, it is representative of the area's early architecture, and perhaps dates as far back as the American Revolution, when this corner of Virginia was still rugged and untamed. A lodging place of one sort or another has stood on the site of the Bolling Wilson Hotel almost continuously for more than 200 years. The earliest of these was the humble Bell Tavern, which was built sometime before 1811. By the time one of the founding fathers of Wytheville, Thomas Jefferson Boyd, purchased the tavern in 1842, it had been expanded into a much larger four-story building with distinctive dormer windows. As the town developed, boarding houses and other small hotels also began to appear, including the Noel House on the 300 block of East Main Street, the Fleming Rich House, which still stands at 480 East Main Street, the Sayers House, which was once at 270 East Main Street. Next door to the Sayers House, Giboney Hall, the Old Virginia House, which once stood near the southwest corner of Main and 4th Streets, and the Old Plumer College on East Withers Road, which hosted boarders during the college's summer recess. In 1857, Thomas Jefferson Boyd sold the old tavern, by then known as the Boyd House, to Robert and Stephen Crockett, who renamed it the Crockett Hotel. The coming of the railroad made Southwest Virginia a fashionable summertime retreat for the well-heeled from the deep south and the coastal lowlands, where reprieve could be found from the oppressive heat and humidity. The popular English Reverend George Muller described the climate and idyllic scenery in this corner of Virginia as remarkably similar to that of Switzerland, and resort towns like Wytheville marketed themselves accordingly. Holidaymakers also came for the mineral waters which flowed forth from springs throughout Wythe County. The pseudoscience of hydropathy, which insisted that mineral water possessed curative powers, was widely subscribed to in the mid-19th century. Even if the cool, clean water did not possess the power to heal the sick, it certainly provided much-needed refreshment during the warm summer months. Affluent resort towns like Hot Springs and White Sulphur Springs catered to the most elite of this clientele. But sleepy hamlets like Wytheville also attracted a fair share of this market, where hotels and boarding houses would rent rooms at weekly and monthly rates throughout the summer. The same year Boyd sold his hotel on Main Street, he built another larger hotel on the edge of town. The 4-story, 40-room hotel was by every metric more upscale than its predecessor, including such posh features as tennis courts and call bells for servants. The depot that welcomed so many holidaymakers to Wytheville stood opposite the Boyd Hotel, and still stands today on Railroad Avenue. Not to be outdone, and also wishing to participate in the summer boarding market, the Crockett underwent extensive refurbishment. By the early 1870s, the hotel had come to boast 50 rooms, which were rented at $2 for the night, $10 for the week, and $25 to $33 for the entire month. In fact, the Crockett was advertised as the largest hotel in Southwest Virginia, offering to its guests a bar, billiard room, parlors, and even a ballroom. In 1884, yet another hotel was established in Wytheville with aims of catering to summer boarders. The 4th Avenue Hotel, on the corner of Main and 4th Streets, boasted 30 rooms at rates comparable to the Boyd and the Crockett, as well as a horse-drawn omnibus to carry guests to and from the depot across town. Not long after, an extravagant bed and breakfast, called the Lion Lodge for the ornamental lions gracing its front porch, was also built at 460 West Main Street. An opera house, too, was erected on the corner of Church and Spring Streets, which was popular with locals and holidaymakers alike. Around the turn of the century, the old Crockett Hotel had been sold and renamed once again, this time for its newest owner, Mr. C.N. Odie. The Hotel Odie was comparatively short-lived, however, as it was destroyed by fire in August of 1913. Another fire, the most disastrous one in Wytheville's long history of fires, destroyed even more of downtown in 1924. With several blocks worth of buildings now gone, a large swath of downtown Wytheville was by now a blank canvas, ready for new development. The American love affair with the automobile had blossomed into full swing by the 1920s. Companies like Ford made it easier for ordinary Americans to travel, and it wasn't long before the automobile began to influence the way we designed our towns as much as it changed our daily routines. Not even sleepy little Wytheville was immune to the honking horns of the future. In 1926, with redevelopment of Wytheville's downtown well underway, the board of directors began accepting bids from contractors for a new, modern hotel fit for the automobile age, which would sit partially on the site of the old Crockett Hotel. 16 bids were considered from contractors as far afield as Roanoke and Bristol. The board ultimately accepted the bid placed by Morris Miller and Son of Christiansburg, who agreed to deliver the new hotel within 18 months at a total cost of $78,000. Construction began in the spring of 1927. Built entirely of concrete and masonry, the new George Wythe was touted as fireproof. The basement was designed to accommodate housekeeping, storage, and utility space. On the ground floor was an expansive lobby that one newspaper admired as being grand enough for a hotel several times larger. The front desk, with its wooden cabinetry and marble countertop, was situated here, with commanding views of both of the lobby's entrances. Another focal point in the stately main lobby was a grandmother clock. Photographs of the George Wythe's original interiors are extremely rare and few in number, although photographs from sister hotels operated by the same management company give an idea of how the hotel's interior was originally decorated. There was a ballroom, a dining room, a kitchen with monitor windows for ventilation, a barber shop, and office space for the Chamber of Commerce. 42 guest rooms were situated between the 3 floors above the ground floor. All the rooms boasted ensuite bathrooms, 30 of which included bathtubs. Every sink offered both hot and cold running water, a modern convenience for a small-town hotel in the 1920s. Other modern conveniences offered at the George Wythe included an elevator, a driveway and porte-cochere, and off-street parking. Indisputably, the George Wythe was designed to appeal to men traveling for business. The cigar counter at the front desk, the in-house barbershop, and the robust neoclassical facade itself were all intended to appeal to masculine sensibilities. Even the design of the public restrooms on the ground floor illustrated this. The women's restroom featured only 1 sink and toilet, and paled in comparison to the size of the men's restroom next door. Traveling salesmen were a popular market. An 8-foot-wide room with a single bed, sink, and toilet could be rented for a mere $1.50. An open house was held at the newly completed George Wythe Hotel on December 6, 1927, where the public was able to inspect the new jewel in Wytheville's crown. A ceremonial opening was held 2 days later on December 8th, and was followed by a lavish banquet. The George Wythe's first manager was Walter F. Paul, employed by Grenoble Hotels, who leased and operated the George Wythe. A number of general managers would also call the George Wythe Hotel home, as was common industry practice for the time. The new hotel instantly assumed pride of place as one of Wytheville's preeminent hotels, appearing at the top of the list in advertisements as far away as New York City. Despite being known as an appealing hotel for traveling salesmen, the George Wythe still wore many other hats. The old Wytheville High School, which sorely lacked a gymnasium, held prom here every spring. Civic organizations, including the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Lions Club, the Rotary Club, the Chamber of Commerce, and many others also regularly met here. For years, the George Wythe Hotel invited many of Wythe County's hard-working families to a Christmas dinner. Beneath 2 Christmas trees on either end of the ballroom were presented an abundance of gifts for boys and girls, ensuring no child in attendance missed out on the magic of Christmas.
It was the center of social activities. I remember that fashion show that we had. That was a big affair. And I remember tables all around so the people who wore the dresses and who dressed up could walk and talk and be a fashion lady. And I just happened to be one of the fashion ladies. I was trim, much younger than I am now. I'm almost 100.
From fashion shows to wedding receptions, the ballroom of the George Wythe is best remembered by some as a place of glamour and festivity. Jean Lester and her husband Steve were one of many newlywed couples who had their wedding reception here.
I was married in the morning at 10 o'clock in the morning, so I had a breakfast-like reception, a brunch, and it was quite nice. It was May 5th, 1962. We didn't hang around for the reception. We sneaked out the back door came up in one of these rooms and changed in clothes, and we sneaked out the back door and just left everybody at the reading reception and went to the watch the horse races.
Charlie and Dorothy Haymore spent their honeymoon in room 406 at the George Wythe Hotel, after which Mrs. Haymore took the room key home as a souvenir. The key finally came back to the hotel in 2014, and probably holds the George Wythe's record for latest checkout. For others, the George Wythe offered a place of employment.
55 and 56 of the years that I worked here. For African Americans, it was only 3 places to work in Whitfield. One was the George Wythe Hotel. One was the town of Whitfield. The other was in someone's cook kitchen. You had a sense of importance because of how the George Wythe Hotel was run or operated with uniformed employees, and when you come into this building, you feel like you were in a professional environment.
A handful of employees who came to work at the George Wythe became synonymous with the hotel. Perhaps the most beloved, and most revered of them, was James Chapman.
He made sure that you were standing correctly at the elevator. He was an African American guy, so he made sure that if you did your job, that he was apparently going to report back to the manager or the owner.
And I remember the elevator operator, he had all the keys, and he had this huge brass ring. I mean, huge, looked like almost a hula hoop that he wore around his neck, and he operated the elevator, and I can't remember his name, but he was a gentleman and uniformed the whole bit,
Mr. Chapman made sure that everybody was treated fairly. If Mr. Chapman wasn't treated fairly, you never heard anything about it. Anyway, you had your place, and that was the norm, and that was the key words, your place. Things have changed. It's changed for the better.
During the summer of 1950, Whitfield suddenly became the epicenter of one of the most severe outbreaks of polio in America.
This was the main road west. People just went through here flying with masks over their face and their faces covered. They were scared to death. And there was a sign out at each end at town limits, general risk. Classmates. You used to have roll call every day at school. And then you knew that her name would be next. She wasn't there. That was bad. Yeah, I lost a couple of classmates.
Local authorities imposed a strict quarantine in Whitfield that summer. Like many businesses, the George Wythe struggled. The hotel managed to keep its doors open, luckily, for at least one traveler.
I remember from the polio epidemic, and I can see this hotel. This is well as I could yesterday. Across the street, where this bank is now, there was a service station on that corner. And I remember as a child sitting in my father's pickup truck, and I saw the police stop a lady coming through town, and she had a face covered. And they said, you can't leave. It was quarantine. If you were in town, you couldn't leave town. If you come to town, once you got in town, you couldn't go out. But I remember that, and I remember seeing the hotel. He pointed to the hotel. This is a good place to stay.
By the early 1970s, the George Wythe had lost much of its luster. The old hotel had seen little investment over the years, and had gradually become faded and worn. The new Interstate 81 also diverted through traffic away from downtown Whitfield. New motels with more modern facilities alongside the interstate proved more convenient and attractive to travelers than the old George Wythe.
And the hotel went out of style, really. and it started going kind of downhill. I happened to be on a board, and remember we discussed what to do with the hotel to make it nice and people would like to stay there, but we realized it was going downhill. So we eventually sold the hotel.
Unable to compete any longer, the George Wythe Hotel finally closed after 46 years of operation in 1973. The Bank of Speedwell purchased the building and relocated their headquarters there soon after auctioning off many of the old George Wythe's interior fittings. Some items, like this pot rack from the hotel's kitchen, and this light fixture from the ballroom, survive today in private collections throughout Wythe County.
It just took away. It shouldn't have been a bank, in my opinion. In my humble opinion, it shouldn't have been a bank. But at that time, it was the only thing to keep it surviving.
Other buildings of significant cultural value in downtown Wytheville were not so fortunate. The Opera House on Church Street had long since burned. The old Boyd Hotel had also been lost to a fire, and the old railroad depot had fallen silent after Norfolk and Western discontinued passenger service through the New River Valley. The Fourth Avenue Hotel, which had long since closed, was razed in the 1970s, as was the old Lion Lodge up the street. Nearly all of the old boarding houses which once dotted Main Street, many of which predated the Civil War, were also gone by this time. So much of Wytheville's architectural heritage had vanished by the waxing decades of the 20th century. But the old George Wythe, or at least the building it once occupied, managed to survive. A variety of local businesses rented the hotel's upper floors, although the Bank of Speedwell, and a string of other banks formed through successive mergers, would continue to occupy the ground floor of the former George Wythe Hotel for several decades. The reign of the stylish hotel that once sat pride of place on Wytheville's Main Street was over.
For Wall Street, it was another case of whiplash. The markets haven't been this volatile in almost 80 years. For the past 50 days, the S&P 500 has whipsawed up and down an average of nearly 4% every day. That hasn't happened since the late 1920s.
By the time of the Great Recession in the late 2000s, branch banking and trust was operating out of the old George Wythe Hotel. And like many businesses hit hard by the recession, the bank was eager to trim its operating costs wherever possible. Having long admired the hotel, local real estate developers Bill and Farron Smith expressed interest in purchasing the building. Smith Enterprises acquired this historic landmark in 2010 with the intention of restoring the building to its original purpose. 40 years of service as a bank, however, had left the building drastically altered from its original appearance. The commanding front desk with its marble top was long gone. Brass light fixtures and woodwork had also been removed years earlier. The footprint of the guest rooms on the second floor had been entirely gutted to accommodate open office space. Nevertheless, a surprising amount of the old George Wythe Hotel had survived the ravages of time. Plaster cornices, terrazzo floors, and staircase railings, all left in situ, still evoked the charm of what was once Wytheville's premier lodging house. Restoration began immediately. All the mechanical systems had to be entirely replaced. The building was replumbed, rewired, and re-roofed. A new porte-cochere, much larger than the original one which had been removed decades earlier, was added. Running from the lobby to the fourth floor, the principal staircase was extended another flight in order to access a new rooftop deck. The most dramatic alteration to the hotel was its guest room arrangement. The old George Wythe featured 14 rooms on each of the 3 guest room floors. Most of these rooms were small, some only 8 feet wide, and some whose bathrooms did not feature a shower or bathtub. In order to appeal to contemporary tastes, the total number of rooms were reduced from 42 to 30 and made larger, and all were given a full ensuite bathroom, with designer touches. Instead of restoring the hotel's former name, the Smiths ultimately decided that the name Bolling Wilson should grace the front porch's architrave. The new name was a direct reference to First Lady Edith Bolling Wilson, who was born and raised in the home directly across the street from the hotel. Edith was born in the humble home above the storefronts in 1872. She was directly related to Thomas Jefferson, Martha Washington, and Pocahontas, and would become First Lady of the United States after her marriage to President Woodrow Wilson in 1915. Edith assumed the role of First Lady with noblesse oblige. During the First World War, she insisted that the White House adhere to the same rationing guidelines as ordinary American households. Edith named nearly 100 warships and volunteered long hours at a Red Cross canteen. Even during baseball games, the First Lady sat beside the President, watching intently while her knitting needles clicked away, crafting socks for soldiers. After the end of the war, Edith sailed for Europe with Wilson to attend the Paris Peace Conference. It was the first time an American First Lady had ever left the country during her tenure. Millions of people crowded the streets of London, Paris, and Rome, cheering in gratitude for the American intervention that brought 4 grueling years of war to an end. Edith's presence beside Wilson among Europe's kings and queens made the role of America's First Lady more publicly visible than ever before, paving the way for the modern brand of First Lady that we recognize today. As world leaders convened in Paris for the historic conference, the support Edith offered to Wilson was invaluable. The American president played a dominant role in crafting the peace negotiations that would redraw borders and redefine the geopolitical order. Wilson had hoped that his 14 points would influence a peace based in the ideas of democracy and self-determination, realized in the League of Nations, an international organization where nation-states would settle disputes through diplomacy rather than the battlefield. His vision was met with resistance from Europe's empires, who had no wish to relinquish power over millions of subjects and colonies wrapping around the globe. Instead of Wilson's goal of creating institutions that could work together to avoid another devastating conflict, peace negotiations ultimately focused on punishing Germany for its aggression and denying any discussion of granting independence to colonies of the former German Empire. At home, ratification of the Treaty of Versailles was rejected by the new Republican majority in the Senate. Without support from the United States, the League of Nations struggled to fulfill its peacekeeping mission. Wilson himself prophesied, "I can predict with absolute certainty that within another generation there will be another world war, if the nations of the world do not concert the method by which to prevent it." Taxed by years of overwork, Wilson suffered an ischemic stroke in October 1919 that left him partially paralyzed. At the insistence of the president's doctors, Edith stepped in to protect her husband's fragile health. She also understood the pressing need for continuity of government, and established herself as the sole line of communication between the president and everyone else. Referring to herself as the gatekeeper, Edith alone determined which matters of state were worth presenting to Wilson and which were not. She relegated matters to department heads and left all other orders of business in abeyance, careful never to exert her own prerogative over affairs of state. Never far from her roots, Edith ordered bottled mineral water shipped to the White House from Wyrick Spring, just outside Wytheville, believing that the mineral water's curative powers aided in Wilson's recovery. The First Lady's devotion to her husband and his office carried Wilson through the remaining 17 months of his second term, ensuring the peaceful transition of executive power that defines American democracy. Historians still debate the true extent of Edith's influence during the end of Wilson's presidency, a debate that continues to shape our perception of the unique role that is America's First Lady. One of the great love stories of presidential history came to an end when Woodrow Wilson died in 1924. The 28th President of the United States left behind a complicated legacy. Edith devoted the rest of her life to memorializing many aspects of that legacy, including her husband's unrealized vision of world peace. Fittingly, the Bolling Wilson Hotel is loosely themed around the life of Edith Bolling Wilson, with each of the 3 guest room floors decorated in motifs of canaries, recalling her grandmother's beloved pets, whom Edith cared for as a child, orchids, Edith's favorite flower, and bourbon, a favorite remedy for illness. The hotel's restaurant, Gray's on Main, is dedicated to Woodrow and Edith's decision to bring sheep to graze on the south lawn of the White House during the First World War, whose wool was auctioned to benefit the Red Cross. If one looks closely, they may even find a sheep or 2 grazing on the Bolling Wilson's lawn. Edith Bolling Wilson traveled extensively throughout her life. Her first journey into the world took place from Wytheville's Humboldt train station as a 12-year-old girl in 1885, and one of her final journeys was a return visit to Wytheville in 1960 at the age of 88. The former First Lady had been invited to dedicate a stained glass window at St. John's Episcopal Church to her parents, who were respected members of the community in the late 19th century. On this final visit to her hometown, during which she stayed at the old George Wythe Hotel, Edith also paid a visit to her old childhood home across the street before returning to Washington, where she died the following year. The old Bolling home is now a museum dedicated to sharing the story of Edith's life from Wytheville to the White House. It is one of only 8 museums in the United States dedicated to interpreting the life of a First Lady. A number of organizations have praised the Bolling Wilson Hotel as an anchor that has played an indispensable role in revitalizing downtown Wytheville. In truth, it is the Edith Bolling Wilson Birthplace Foundation and Museum that deserves this distinction, as the hotel we see today would not exist without this historical gem or its noteworthy namesake. A story about the Bolling Wilson would not be complete without mentioning its share of guests who have still yet to check out. Strange happenings have been reported around the hotel, from heavy doors that open and close by themselves, to an elevator that ran between floors at will, to the sound of clinking dishes in the restaurant, to voices emanating from empty rooms. Perhaps the best-known ghost in the hotel is a tall gentleman wearing a coat and bowler hat, whose appearance was first noted in the 1960s. The man has been known to smile and tip his hat before walking out the side door of the main lobby. Former bellhop James Kelly insisted that the man is a ghost of a waiter who once worked in the hotel's restaurant. The mysterious man was seen recently in the gift shop, although he vanishes whenever he is approached by a member of staff. Bank employees who worked in the building before the Bolling Wilson's restoration frequently saw a man in a gray suit who would also vanish into thin air. Computers were known to type on their own, and office supplies would go missing and reappear at random. On one occasion, the elevator, having opened randomly on the 3rd floor with no passengers aboard, was followed by all the toilets in the building flushing simultaneously. The bank's employees attributed these inexplicable goings-on to 2 ghosts whom they affectionately named Trish and Josh. It's difficult to say why these handful of phantoms still linger at the Bolling Wilson. Nevertheless, their innocent mischief is part of the long human story of this grand old hotel. Since its opening in 2014, the Bolling Wilson Hotel has transformed Wytheville. Commercial activity on Main Street had suffered as industry slowly declined in Wythe County through the end of the 20th century. And by the end of the 2000s, a new Walmart supercenter had forced more locally owned businesses to close their doors. Like many small towns in America, the number of empty storefronts on Main Street far outnumbered those that were occupied. Renewed interest in Wytheville's revitalization mirrors national trends, as Americans become increasingly aware of how large corporate chains can profoundly change our communities. More landmarks have also been saved by new businesses, like the old Masonic Hall on Main Street. Built in 1884, it was nearly demolished before being rehabilitated, and is now home to a locally owned restaurant. Another local landmark given a new lease on life is the old Millwall Theater on Main Street. It was one of the longest operating theaters in the United States when it was forced to close in 2006, after both a large chain movie theater and a dinner theater opened in town in the early 2000s. After a 2-year restoration aided by rehabilitation tax credits, the restored Millwall Theater reopened in December 2022 and is once again a nucleus of local culture. Other restorations in Wytheville are also on the horizon. The extension of Amtrak service from Lynchburg to Roanoke in 2017 became so unexpectedly popular that it soon proved to be the only profitable Amtrak line in Virginia. With population growth in the New River Valley compounding an already crowded interstate highway system, Amtrak has committed to extending passenger service to Christiansburg as early as 2026. Recently, the Commonwealth of Virginia released a report detailing estimated costs associated with the extension of Amtrak service all the way to Bristol, which would restore passenger service through Wytheville. It is not inconceivable that a passenger train could once again call here and bring with it the many economic benefits associated with a passenger rail connection. During the global coronavirus pandemic, the very survival of the Bolling Wilson Hotel was challenged, just as the survival of the George Wythe Hotel was under threat during the polio epidemic in the 1950s. As pandemic life recedes into memory, business has once more rebounded, keeping the hotel and its staff of 40 employees busy, while entertaining questions of possible expansion in the near future. In a subtle way, the Bolling Wilson embodies the many layers of Wytheville's centuries-old tradition of hospitality. For some, the hotel is a resting place for travelers, like the old taverns of the 18th century. For others, it is a destination in and of itself, as was the old Crockett Hotel that once stood here, and many other lodging places in Wytheville during the 19th century. And like the old George Wythe Hotel in its time, the Bolling Wilson is a modern contemporary hotel and center of social activity. For Bill and Farron Smith, the mission of restoring Wytheville's most prominent historic landmark was to preserve this important part of Southwest Virginia's heritage for the future. That mission continues to inspire other local organizations. In 2023, the grandmother clock that once stood in the lobby of the old George Wythe Hotel also returned home. After the George Wythe closed in 1973, the clock was purchased at auction by the Chitwood family and donated to the Wythe County Historical Society. Wytheville's historic Rock House Museum displayed the clock in their collection for half a century. After the completion of the Bolling Wilson Hotel, the Historical Society graciously returned the grandmother clock, which once again stands sentinel in this commanding lobby. One of the great ironies of clocks is that they are unable to tell us their stories. If they could, this clock would tell us how celebrating history has the power to transform our communities, and how that adventure, in the end, transforms the way we see our landmarks, each other, and not least of all, ourselves.